It's a beautiful bacon day, Cookie Crusaders. Today we're going to be talking about candy toppings. This one's not very covered as you do not really see it in any meta talk or in any specific builds, but I do still want to cover it because it is still important to discuss. So, the candy toppings themselves, we're going to run that in our second battle. We're going to show you what it looks like with no toppings on to start, and then what it is with the suggested or meta toppings that we're going to be analyzing on just this one cookie. Now, what I'm going to be showing will apply to most cookies in most situations, but I'll kind of describe the differences and where candy toppings are going to really play a difference. So what we're going to do is we're going to fight this team. We're just going to use pomegranate for the 30% attack buff, and then caramel arrow for the overall attacks on this lower level team, so that you can just see a generalized results and really pay attention to the time, because that's what we can really measure easily, since the team is going to have the same amount of health each time. So with no toppings on, it took 22 seconds to deal about 1.3 million damage. That was to clear out the team, and as far as the healing received, was 187,000 healing received with no toppings on caramel arrow. Now, when we move over to the candy toppings, you can see here we have about 7.3% attack buff, a 5.5% crit buff, and a 1.3% attack speed buff. But really the important stat that I try to get on here that really truly will affect the numbers will be the Amplify Buff, which is at 16%. So what that means is that we should get a 16.1% buff of the 30% attack buff Pomegranate's giving, and we will also get a 16.1% buff of the healing that we're getting too. And so nothing on Pomegranate is changing, but we are getting the buffs on Caramel Arrow from the candy toppings. And so you can see instead of 22 seconds, it took 19.3 seconds. We did about the same amount of damage, so we can't really do much more just because there's no more additional cookies, and the damage they got was enough to take them out. The healing received was 226,000, so we received almost 40,000 more. But if you do 16% of 183,000, that adds up to about that. And so what I want you to notice here is that we're getting an additional benefit. We're getting a team personal benefit on our side here, and that's what's happening. And so any buff, anything that's helping a teammate, it is being increased by that Amplify buff. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that for the moment, and then I'm going to move over to the critical toppings to show you the difference of speed and setup of damage and everything. And so to show you that the results aren't going to be massively crazy, we're just going to run that. And this is, of course, critical focused. So this is just the idea of speedily killing the team. And as you can see, it works, no problems. But then we go to the results. We've got 17.5 seconds, so faster. We got way more damage, and that's because we were able to do massive bursts of damage to each cookie. Even if it had all of its health taken, it was able to do like spillover damage, if that makes sense. And so healing received 185,000. Well, that's because we don't have any Amplify buff happening, and the only reason our damage wasn't necessarily better on the candy topping was because there wasn't really any additional attack percentage. There wasn't any additional critical percentage happening to do more critical damage to the other cookies. All that was really happening was we were buffing the attack percent of 30% by 16.1%. So that is just a little over 3% more attack percentage buff from Pomegranate happening to Caramel Arrow. And if that's all that's happening, that's not really enough to push a massive amount of damage to keep up with the apple jelly toppings. So the instances I want to talk about where the candy toppings are going to be really useful will probably be in a future thing, in a future team. I haven't found a team that it fits in perfectly yet, But what's interesting is that, let's say you were running a completely buff team focus only. Like, that was your goal. You wanted them to have attack buffs, you wanted them to have speed buffs, you wanted them to have defensive buffs, damage resistant buffs, all of that. That's where candy toppings are going to really shine, is just buffing those to higher percentages so that you have a higher point than the opposing team does. Now, with the cherry blossom cookie coming out, if that cookie does indeed have a damage reflection skill that has been talked about, then what may end up happening is that the overall percentages may be better boosted by Amplify Buff with higher percent heals or higher defensive heals. Anything that is being buffed in that sense could be helpful from just an Amplify Buff sense. Now, you can, of course, just go with the regular toppings and then get Amplify Buff as a substat, so it's not like you have to specifically go to the candy, but you can only have a 10% max Amplify Buff substat, where you can have 3% on the actual topping itself. So that means you can get a total max of 25%, absolute maximum. Anything more than that, you are getting it from other means, monuments, lab upgrades, anything that can give it. That's the only other places you're going to be getting that from. And the reason for that is because if they had it at a higher point, like let's say you could get up to 70% Amplify Buff, like you can some other substats with the whole setups with the toppings and topping substats, then you could start having it where it was almost like you had two of the same cookie on the same field with specific buffs. Maybe you would have 70% buff on Strawberry Crepe's 50% damage resistance buff. That means that the cookies that are getting the damage resistance buffs, they barely even have to have almond toppings on as long as Strawberry Crepe's fast enough, because they're having such huge damage resistant buffs. So I can see why they have that at a lower stat, is because what it can do is really good, but it has to be the focus. If you are not running the buffs as the focus of the team, you're not really going to get a huge benefit out of it. You can, of course, get benefits of it if it's just like a random substat that you pulled, so it's not that it's useless, as it's really easy to get to 2% since that's such a small pool of substat bonus effect possibilities. But at the same time, because of that, it's not something that people really go for. But I still wanted to discuss and talk about it so that people had a good understanding of how it can be helpful and where it can be used. And what it does specifically is only buffs the user from the buffs that they are getting from the team. So if you are giving someone else a buff, you're not buffing that. You're only getting a buff of what you, specifically the cookie, is getting. So if you are not buffing yourself and you're not being buffed by other cookies on your team, Amplify Buff percentages are not being useful on that cookie at that time. Let me know in the comments if you have any teams that you've experimented with just buff specifically. Any 5 cookies that you think would be like a really powerhouse buff team, like if that was the focus. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you.